Okay, I need some clarification. How do you not find one but see one?
We saw a dried museum specimen that was brought to us after dinner in a dark back alley.
I can't tell how much of this is made up and how much
This is absolutely true.
Okay, what? What?
Super sketchy, super, seemed really weird, but it was nice to see the specimen.
Hey there, Podcast Aquanauts. It's your host, Casey here. Okay, one of my favorite things about working at the aquarium is getting to see how my coworkers' knowledge and experience make them bona fide experts in their respective fields. They're frequently called on to weigh in on topics ranging from the medical care of exotic species to offering advice on how to encourage critically endangered animals to reproduce in human care. It's all very inspiring stuff, and I'm always pleased to say I work with these amazing people, even if it's a vicarious sort of pride, considering I'm an expert in basically nothing. Recently, 2 of our biologists at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute and a visiting graduate student were invited to travel thousands of miles deep into Central Asia to act as the expert spearheads of a quest to find the world's smallest sturgeon species, which hasn't been seen in more than half a century. In this episode, we'll learn all about this journey to ascertain the fate of the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, our scientists' history studying this missing marvel, and how this globe-trotting voyage found them face-to-face with a preserved specimen in a back alley under circumstances that sound more like a scene from a Cold War spy film than a biological game of Where's Waldo. I don't know about you, but my interest is piqued. So let's get to it, shall we? On with the podcast. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. Today, we are back at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute on the banks of the Tennessee River with a trio, well, at the moment at least it's a duo, but eventually it might be a trio of scientists who recently embarked on a pretty incredible trip to Asia on looking for an animal that hasn't been seen in a long, long time. But before we get too into the episode, I'll go ahead and work my way through or around the table making introductions, starting with Christian
Swartzbaugh.
Christian, you are a graduate student at the University of Georgia, correct?
That's correct.
And why are you here? Go ahead and give people some background on your involvement here at Tennessee.
I am here to study fish behavior, actually. So I am working on a project looking at the interactions between minnows, the Tennessee dace and the western black-nosed dace, in the hopes that the findings from this research will help inform how we could better reintroduce the laurel dace into the wild.
The laurel dace, which has been the subject of a couple of different episodes of the podcast in the past. So if I'll leave some links down in the description of the show with links to those episodes talking about the laurel dace. But welcome, Christian. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And opposite you and next to me on the other side is Dr. Bernie Kuhajda. Bernie, you are an aquatic conservation biologist. What does that mean?
It means I play with fishes out in the rivers, streams, caves, and springs in the southeast.
Okay, and you were not working in the southeast. The subject of today's episode is the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon. And before we dig into the trip, I want to talk more about the animal first. So what is the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon?
Adorable. It's a miniature sturgeon. Maximum size 9 inches.
Oh, that is small. I didn't realize they were that small.
It is one of, if not the smallest sturgeon in the world. It has 3 different forms. A long, long snout with no filament coming off the tail. An intermediate length snout with a short filament coming off the tail, and a really short snout with a really long, long filament coming off the tail. And the last specimen seen in the 1960s and maybe the early 1970s was the short snouted, long tail filament form. Why is that important? Because a fish with a long filament coming off of its tail is not going to look like any other fish in the Syr Darya. So if you see a fish with a whip-like tail, we know you've seen the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon.
We should probably back up and explain that the Syr Darya is a river.
It is. Just like Rio Grande, you don't have to say river because Rio is river, Darya is river. So If you say Syr Darya River, you're saying Syr River, technically.
Okay. And Syr is in, so that is in what language, Bernie?
All of the Central Asia languages. So the Syr Darya and Amu Darya are the two main rivers that feed the Aral Sea. That is an endorheic sea that has no outlet. That's what that means. The freshwater rivers feed it, and it's in the middle of a semi-arid to arid environment, and the water just evaporates off of the sea, and that was the ecosystem before people decided it would be a real good idea to raise cotton, a very water-thirsty crop, in a semi-arid to arid environment. And the Soviet Union back in the 1960s and 70s pumped so much water out of these two rivers that the Aral Sea shrunk to 1/5 of its normal size.
And it used to be one of the largest lakes on Earth, right?
Yes, and now it's the largest ecological disaster to date in the world.
Wow. I did not realize that. So the point of this trip that you went on, you mentioned earlier, you kind of hinted at it by saying that this animal hasn't been seen since the 1960s. So for the last 60 years, this animal has been missing. Why do we think that is?
Modifications to its habitat. The Syr Darya is supposed to be a muddy river that flows through very erodible soil, so the channel is shifting all of the time. And like many other sturgeon, in the life history of the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, we predict that the larvae, the little tiny sturgeon that just come out of the egg and absorb their yolk sac, they swim up into water current and ride that water current like a vulture rides the air currents, using hardly any energy and feeding on plankton that's floating in the river. Now you throw a bunch of reservoirs in the Syr Darya. Now that larval sturgeon hits that still water, it has to use all its energy to stay up in the water column to feed on plankton, and it uses more energy than it takes in, and it dies. So sturgeon worldwide, across the northern hemisphere, that's the only place you find sturgeon, the largest impact to them have been reservoirs and the dams that create them.
And so closer to home then, an example of a sturgeon with which we work pretty closely would be the lake sturgeon. So that's a similar story for the lake sturgeon. They were historically impacted and I guess continue to be impacted by dams.
We think so. The lake sturgeon, it has the shortest larval drift of any North American sturgeon. It's average about 16 or 17 kilometers.
And that's that period that it's just floating in the water column, not
Right.
expending energy.
Whereas shovelnose and pallid sturgeons you find over in the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, and shovelnose sturgeon are also in the Ohio River, they have to drift 150 to 250 miles as larvae. So there, if there's any dams like on the Missouri River, you have no recruitment. You have reproduction. You have sturgeon spawning, fertilizing eggs, having embryos. The embryos hatch, but the larvae just don't transform into juveniles because they don't have enough river to float in. And also a lot of our sturgeon that live in the ocean and come back to freshwaters to spawn, if that dam is only 30 or 40 miles from the ocean, those larvae, they float down, they hit salt water, and they die. So, and this has been a problem, like I said, across the world are these reservoirs. We don't know for either the Syr Darya or the two species of shovelnose sturgeon in the Amu Darya in the southern tributary to the Aral Sea. We don't know how long those larvae have to drift. But because of the rapid disappearance of the Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon, my best guess is it's the reservoirs and interrupting that life history aspect with the larval drift.
So the reason that I'm even aware of the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, this animal that hasn't been seen for 60 years, is because of you. So I became aware of it back in 2019 because you were approached by the Search for Lost Species, which is a global effort to rediscover species that have been missing for at least 10 years. In some cases, some of these animals haven't been seen in over a century. So the Syr Darya kind of fits within that spectrum. The Search for Lost Species approached specialists to take up the mantle of looking for these animals. Why were you approached specifically for the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon?
Well, for my dissertation, to get my PhD, I studied the riverine shovelnose sturgeon across the world. That includes 3 species in North America, the pallid sturgeon, shovelnose sturgeon, and Alabama sturgeon, and 3 species in Central Asia, the Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon and the large and small Amu Darya shovelnose sturgeon. So I actually traveled to Turkmenistan in 1999 and collected several specimens and became involved in a tagging and tracking study on the large Amu Darya shovelnose sturgeon, which has 2 forms, a dwarf form and a regular size form. And we also worked some with the small Amu Darya shovelnose sturgeon, which also has 2 forms, a short-snouted form and a long-snouted form. And it's interesting, we've done the genetics on these because we have live fish where we could get fin clips, and there's no genetic differences between these forms of sturgeon and no genetic differences between the 2 species.
So you were approached then because you are one of the only people who's ever worked with this species then?
Correct.
Okay. So that initial search back in 2019 obviously must not have produced results because you have since gone back to look for this animal more times.
Yes, in 2019, we went and sampled the Syr Darya in Kazakhstan, just above a reservoir and below a reservoir near the Uzbekistan border. We did not find the Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon, but we collected hundreds and hundreds of native fishes. And we interviewed several fishermen, and 2 of them describing a fish they caught with a whip-like tail. One of them as soon as 2017.
So you had reason to think that even if you didn't find them, they may actually still be in that area.
Exactly. So our mission this time was to look further upstream in the river in Uzbekistan, where the river is more channelized and braided and has islands. And we also wanted to not only physically look for the fish with nets, but filter water, catch any DNA floating around in the rivers, send that to an environmental DNA lab, and look for the DNA of the Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon on those filters. Because it's really difficult to find a 9-inch fish that's very rare in a river the size of the Tennessee River.
So it's kind of like the equivalent of dusting for fingerprints, right? You're looking for trace elements that show that this animal was or is in this environment. Even if you're not seeing it, you're seeing signs that it has been there.
Exactly.
Okay. Christian, I feel like I've left you silent sitting at the other side of the table. How did you get roped into going on this trip? Because the reason you're on the podcast is because you are a graduate student, but you got to go on this trip with Bernie and with the absent third guest for today's episode. He may show up later, Dave Neely, who hopefully we will get on the show. But you were pulled into this adventure. How did that happen, and why?
Yeah, I'm gonna first throw it back and have Bernie talk a little bit more about explain the origin of this, and then I'll jump in with my part about how I kind of got the chance and the opportunity to be here.
So there is an ichthyologist at Cornell University, Casey Dillman, and he was supposed to go with us. During his postdoctoral research, he actually looked at specimens of Syr Darya and Amu Darya shovelnose sturgeons in museums.
So preserved specimens.
The preserved specimens. And he was able to take some tissue from a specimen that had been preserved in alcohol way back in the 1800s and come up with sequences of DNA from that preserved specimen of the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon. So now we know what the fingerprint looks like.
You knew what to look
look for it on those filters of the water. So because he was very integral in piecing together this detective work to look for this fish, we invited him to go along. Well, he had the opportunity to go to Vietnam and collect a whole lot of species that are undescribed and new, and we got dissed for the tropics.
Oh, you got ditched. No good.
Yeah, no good.
Well, no good for you,
But
good for
me.
Christian. So
Yes. And so I this kind of came about as a joke initially when I said to Bernie, well, I knew there was an open space on the trip, and I said, well, if you need anyone to carry your bags, just haul nets around for you, I'd be happy to. And I kind of joked that, and Bernie, you looked at me kind of seriously. You said, do you want to go? We have another space, and we could use the help in the field. And, I absolutely jumped at this opportunity. It's the realization of a childhood dream to do conservation work internationally. And I think if you had asked 10-year-old me, I probably wouldn't have come up with Uzbekistan initially as the country where I thought I'd go. But I mean, that just made the trip all the more special because it's such a unique system. And to get the opportunity to work with incredible ichthyologists like Bernie and Dave, and collaborate with an international team is truly once in a lifetime. So.
Had you ever been out of the country before?
Yeah, I lived in Germany for 2 years, and I've traveled a bit in Asia and Central America as well, but never to Central Asia. So it was a very different culture.
Okay. And because the first time you get to leave the country is its own kind of culture shock. So you'd already experienced that. So this was a chance to experience the, I'm guessing, equally shocking transition to trying to do conservation work in a different country. I'm assuming that was probably pretty different.
It is radically different, and that was one of the things that I appreciated most about this trip. And even when I was living in Europe, that was still a different experience where I was studying and still playing tourist in a way. But in this way, we were there to do science, which is such a different thing. And I think it shows you a completely different side of a country that you rarely see when you're traveling there and aren't doing work in that way. So, I mean, we saw so much of the countryside. We saw places that I'm sure no tourist would normally go to because we were there for a specific purpose. And that was just really incredible. And then again, to get to interface with local scientists too. I mean, that's a rare opportunity, but so important in science to share cross-culturally.
So how heavy were the bags?
They weren't too bad. Some of the nets were quite heavy, but we actually had a lot of help. So we spread the load pretty equally. So I didn't come back with a broken back.
I'm assuming you did more made more substantial contributions than just carrying things. So what were you doing while you were over there?
I was helping to take some of the eDNA samples, actually physically getting out there and sticking the probe in the water. I was helping to haul the net and pull debris out of this. So I'll let Bernie talk a little bit more about the specifics of sampling, but this is a huge 100-foot net that spans the river, and then we drag down the river. And when you take it out, it catches fish, but it catches a lot of other things too. And so it's a whole process to stand there. And the more hands you have for something like a big operation like that, the easier and the smoother it will go. So I was able to help in that way as well.
So manpower literally was actually a pretty important contribution to this.
Manpower was an important contribution, yes. As I said, I'm a fish behaviorist who studies minnows right now, but the chance to work in a system with sturgeon, which, as we learned from Bernie, are just fascinating animals, was so cool. And just learning about their life history and their ecology was really special.
Now, were you like me? Had you ever heard of this species before Bernie involved you in this adventure?
Not at all. I learned about this species when I came to Tanasi about a year ago, actually, in April. And I remember Bernie talking about a trip that he was planning to go to Uzbekistan, and he kept mentioning this Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon. And I remember looking it up on Google and kind of being fascinated by it. Even back then, just because of the mystery behind it, and it hasn't been seen in 60 years, and so where is it, and how are we going to go find that? So I had been hearing about this for a long time, and then here we are.
Well, and I imagine, most of the species that you work with, or at least that you've worked with in your time here, that I'm aware of, are pretty small fish. The species you mentioned earlier, the western black-nosed dace and the Tennessee dace, are what, 3 inches, 4 inches?
Yeah, 3-4 inches max. I mean, they are minnows, small fish, and so I spend most of my time here looking at these minnows through binoculars, and so I'm no stranger to small fish, but for a sturgeon to be that small, that's pretty unique as well.
Yeah, but I mean, even a 9-inch sturgeon is still substantially larger than the fish you normally work with.
Yes, yeah.
So, Bernie, what was it like going on this international trip with a graduate student, someone who's coming into the field that you've been in at this point for decades? What was it like to share that experience with somebody who was relatively new to ichthyology and biology?
It's always fun just teaching anyone about the amazing world that's under the surface of the water. And no surprise to Christian, he's been working with fishes for quite a while, but just to go to a different country, a completely different environment, different cultures, different ways of collecting fish, which we butted heads a little with the Zoology Institute staff, but they were wonderful.
The Zoology Institute being the Uzbekistan's?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
In the capital of Tashkent is the Institute of Zoology for the Republic of Uzbekistan. And I was not expecting this, but they provided us with 3 vehicles, a boat, and all they asked us to do is pay for fuel and for the drivers of the vehicles. That was it. And we had way more help than I ever thought we would. But it's just interesting. Everyone thinks the nets they use are the best nets. Everyone thinks the method they use is the best. And you even get this in the United States between ichthyologists.
Science fights.
Science fights, you got it. But it was really fun having Christian along because it's always great having someone who studies science from a slightly different angle. I'm a classic taxonomist, naming things and looking at differences between fishes physically and genetically. And then, Christian studies the behavior of fishes, which is really different. And it's just nice having folks with different backgrounds and different perspectives all working towards a common goal.
Kind of rounds out the information that you're gathering.
It really does.
So I want to, before we get into the results of your trip, and I'm going to leave people on pins and needles as to whether you actually saw a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, I do want to take a second to talk a little bit more about the search for lost species, because it's a really fascinating endeavor, one which has grown pretty substantially since I last checked in on it, which was concurrent with your trip back in 2019. At that time, you were looking for just 25 species. There was like a most wanted list of species that they had identified as ones that they really wanted to find out the ultimate fate of, one of which was the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon. Since then, we're welcoming our third guest here. You're going to hear him. The door's going to open and close.
Hey, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
How's it going?
All right, Dave is going to get on mic while I continue to talk about the search for lost species. Since then, it has grown pretty tremendously. It went from 25 species to now more than 4,300 species are targeted as species of interest, I guess, for the search for lost species. And since that search started, they have actually found 15 species that were thought lost. They've rediscovered the Omoltemi cottontail rabbit in Mexico, Attenborough's long-beaked echidna in Indonesia, De Winton's golden mole in South Africa, and the Fernandina Galapagos tortoise in Ecuador, among 11 others. As I said, there are 15. So it's a really cool project, one that I'm glad that we're taking part in, Bernie, through you, and that we're able to talk about on the show. Dave, welcome. I'm glad that you were able to make it on to the episode. I know you were a little bit delayed, but tell everybody what your title is and how you're associated with the Conservation Institute.
I'm an adjunct research scientist. I help out when needed. I work on other projects related to systematics, evolution, conservation of fishes.
So, Dave, we were talking about the adventure that you and Christian and Bernie have been on. talk a little bit about your role on this trip, because was this your first time going to look for the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, or were you on that previous trip in 2019?
I was on the 2019 trip.
Okay. So what exactly, what was your take on what happened back in 2019 and what you experienced most recently on this trip that happened earlier this year?
The 2019 trip, we were stymied by habitats that seemed inappropriate for shovelnose sturgeon. They tended to, that reach of the river was very deep, very brush-filled, very challenging to sample. On Google Earth, it looks like satellite imagery. It looks like there's much better habitat upstream, so we were kind of excited to work areas. It looked like they might be better just from a hydrological standpoint, from a habitat standpoint, better habitat.
What was it like to work there? I mean, if you're contrasting the two experiences, what was it like at this new location versus the old one? Was the satellite imagery correct? I mean, was it easier to sample?
It was, and it would have certainly been better habitat for sturgeons if there hadn't been excessive overfishing and the effects of the dams kind of controlling sediment releases into those reaches. And those things aren't always obvious looking at it via satellite.
Okay, so was that disappointing when you got on the ground? Whoever wants to take this, when you got there and realized that maybe it wasn't nearly as ideal as it had appeared from on high?
I mentioned early in the podcast that these rivers flow through very erodible soils, and naturally they're extremely muddy. And depending on what season or how much snow melt or rain there'd been, you would see pretty muddy water on the Google image from the satellite. So we were hoping that the Syr Darya and some of the tributaries we worked in would be really muddy and highly erodible shorelines, and that wasn't the case in most of the places we visited. Not only do the dams create reservoirs that maybe don't allow drifting larval sturgeon to turn into juveniles, they also hold all the sediments back behind the dam, and you have crystal clear blue water below the dam. And these fishes evolved in extremely turbid water. They've got small eyes. They've got, like all sturgeon, those four whiskers with the taste buds on them.
The barbels.
They've got electric detecting organs on the underside of their head. So they are made to forage for food in very turbid, muddy water. And they don't have to worry about predators as much because nobody else can see them. Now you put them in bright, clear blue rivers, and once again, they're not in the habitat they've evolved in, and they're going to struggle. And so I was a little disappointed on how clear the water was, even as snowmelt had started when we were there in March.
So as a scientist, when you go out to do field work like this, how do you temper your disappointment in situations like this and just carry on with the work? Is that difficult to do, or have you, just having done it for as long as you have, kind of gotten used to working through disappointment?
The great thing about working in aquatic environments, you've got your target species, but you got a lot of other cool stuff that is in that river or that creek or that spring or that cave. So even if you're not seeing the target species, you're going to see a lot of cool stuff.
Usually.
Now, we were a little disappointed in the lower reaches of the Syr Darya, close to the Kazakhstan border. We got very few fishes, and they were all invasive fishes. It was really disappointing. But as we moved further upstream in the system, in the Fergana Valley in eastern Uzbekistan, we started getting native fishes, and we got some really cool fishes.
There are probably some fish nerds listening to this. So what is a cool fish that you found?
One of the neatest groups are some of the snow trouts. Now these are a big minnow that can routinely get to 1/2 meter long or bigger, that physically look like a salmonid. They look like a trout or salmon, but they're related to other Eurasian minnows.
Wow. Okay. Any other cool collections on that trip?
Sculpins, which were really cool.
Oh, I do love a sculpin.
2 species of sculpins that are endemic to the Aral Sea Basin. So that's pretty fun.
some cool catfish, too.
Really?
Yes. We got one catfish, the Wells catfish, which is one of the largest catfishes in the world. We did get a specimen about 3 feet long. But then also we got these cool, they reminded me of our miniature Mad Tom catfishes from the neck back, but the head was totally different. Explain it, Dave.
They're scissorid catfishes, and most of the members of this group have adhesive organs on the breast, the belly, parts of the pectoral fins that allow them to hold position in torrential flows. So they will kind of stick to rocks or the substrate or other structures.
So they're like suctioning.
Kind of, except it's not really suction. It's just increasing the surface area of those structures so that they're held in position by adhesion rather than suction.
That's really cool. Christian, what did you enjoy finding the most on this trip? What stands out to you?
Oh, the catfish were really cool. We also sampled a few loaches as well, and they're incredibly cool. Again, I like the small fish, and they exhibited some gorgeous patterns. Again, they were living in these faster flowing waters as well. And to see how they were adapted to live in these environments through their morphology was just really cool. They're kind of unlike a lot of the things we have in North America.
There's some really cool loaches actually in the Chinese Mountain Stream exhibit in our Rivers of the World gallery in the River Journey building. So if you're ever visiting the aquarium and want to see a loach, they're pretty small, as Christian just mentioned. I think it's the Hillstream Mountain loach or just Hillstream loach. I'm not actually sure. But they are really pretty, and they almost look like little miniature flounder. Like they're really flat-bodied and wide.
The loaches we were finding had longer bodies. They weren't as wide. They're more slender, and that they're adapted for slightly different environments than the Hillstream loach, but nonetheless really cool fish.
We often talk on this show about how special the Southeast is in terms of its biodiversity. So there just being such an abundance of species found in the rivers and streams in and around Chattanooga within about a 500-mile radius. How does the Syr Darya compare in terms of species count? Is it more or less comparable to us? Did it just emphasize to you how special our streams are here in the Southeast?
It's depauperate, but a lot of the things that are there are endemic. They're only there, which makes it a little bit more interesting.
So depauperate meaning there are fewer species?
Lower species diversity, sure. So I think we got 21 species, 22 species overall for the trip, and you could get that in almost any small stream around here.
I think we've been out to Chickamauga Creek and in one afternoon found that many.
Yes.
That's pretty incredible. Yeah, and Bernie, you were shaking your head pretty emphatically that no, it was not as nice as it is here.
State of Tennessee has 335 species of freshwater fishes. They have 1/5 of that in the entire country in Uzbekistan.
So we live in a pretty special place.
It is the most awesomest place ever.
All right. So now it is. Ooh, Dave is. Are you agreeing or disagreeing? I couldn't see this.
Tennessee's awesome, and the Southeast is awesome, but there's lots of other awesome places out there.
The tropics do win for diversity.
All right.
The tropics. That's why Casey Dillman from Cornell decided to go to Vietnam and not Uzbekistan.
Well, we're a freshwater aquarium, and this is a freshwater-centric podcast, so I'm just going to go ahead and call it a win for the Southeast and move on.
Okay.
All right, we have not. I've been delaying asking this because the whole point of the search for lost species is to find out whether the species is around or not. So, did you find a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon on this trip back in March? Bernie's gesturing to Christian.
We did not.
Wah wah.
Well, not entirely true.
That's actually true. We saw a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon.
We did,
and we may have gotten DNA from those.
Okay, I need some clarification. How do you not find one but see one?
We saw a dried museum specimen that was brought to us after dinner in a dark back alley.
I can't tell how much of this is made up and how much
This is
John.
absolutely true.
Okay, what? What?
Super sketchy, super, seemed really weird, but it was nice to see the specimen.
So like a guy walked up in a trench coat and opened it up and
basically-
Check out my sturgeon.
Yeah. And, there are a bunch of us with headlamps on, all shining down into this box that has been revealed to us in a back alley behind a restaurant. And we were all, that was one of the best experiences of the trip. I mean, it was amazing to see a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon in any form was really special.
So, okay, I feel completely derailed by this, but prior to this, Christian and Dave, had either of you actually seen even a museum specimen of a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, or have you only seen it in pictures?
Not the Syr Darya. I've held specimens of the other two species in the Aral Basin, but not Kaufmanni
Okay.
or Fichenkoe.
So I can understand why that was a pretty special moment then,
Yes.
to see it in person, more or less.
So there is a university in Andijan, and they've got a natural history collection. And when was it collected? The
1950s.
50s, was that it? Someone collected a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, and they dried it and mounted it. And it's been in this natural history collection, unknown to folks until a Russian scientist discovered it there, got a piece of the material, and actually sequenced a large part of its DNA. So, as I mentioned before, now we got the fingerprint to look for the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon on those filters to try to find its environmental DNA.
Okay, and this test made it a positive idea that this specimen that was in the museum was in fact a Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I don't even know how much of this I'm going to keep in. Were you just approached like at dinner by some scientist, or how did this even come about?
Okay, let me back up. So we were there with Akbarjan Rozumov, and he is an Uzbek who got his master's degree at the Institute of Zoology in Uzbekistan and is now working on his PhD in Beijing. He flew from Beijing to Uzbekistan to be part of our expedition. He is good friends with these scientists at the university in Andijan, and so we had dinner with them, and this dried specimen came up in the conversation. He said, "Yeah, you can see it," and so we had dinner with them 4 or 5 days later, and they brought the specimen with them.
Okay, I'm tracking now. That is a crazy story. That you have told me some crazy stories about being out in Mexico and staying the night at potentially cartel leaders' houses and such.
Not potentially, definitely.
Okay, anyway, you have led a more exciting life as a scientist. I think people probably assume scientists lead, so that's definitely an interesting one. All right, so the point of this is to find out I've said repeatedly, it's to find out the ultimate fate of these animals and then the search for lost species, of which the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon is a part. Why does it matter? Why do we care whether this little 9-inch sturgeon is still swimming around the Syr Darya? Why do we care that this Galapagos turtle is still found in Ecuador? Why do we care that this cottontail rabbit is in Mexico? Why is any of this important?
Humans need fresh water to survive. And the more intact an aquatic ecosystem is, the cleaner the water is for humans. If you are just using an aquatic ecosystem for your drinking water, to irrigate, and you really don't pay attention to anything else, you're going to continue to lose species, and that entire system is going to continue to degrade, and pretty soon everyone's going to be fighting over water. If you rediscover a species that hasn't been seen by scientists in 60 years, a species that has been on stamps in Central Asia that has some cultural significance, it is going to ignite a spark and get people excited. Now that spark may be diminished immediately, or it could snowball into some really positive press about how special the Syr Darya River is and steps that can be taken to not let it degrade anymore. And here's an example right here at home, the laurel dace, a tiny little minnow. Why should anyone care? We had a severe drought here. We had to run out and rescue it. Our department, including Casey here at the Tennessee Aquarium, that publicizes everything we do. They put it out to the media. The media got hold of it. We had a fundraising campaign. We're going to have a 5K race to save the laurel dace. And this whole thing has snowballed. And now I'd say a good portion of people in the Chattanooga area have heard of a laurel dace. The same thing could happen in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, if we rediscovered this fish that has some cultural significance. So for me personally, I think that is the reason to look for lost species. Excitement that it can produce.
Dave, do you have anything to contribute to that or add to that?
I mean, species produce a lot of ecological benefits and provide services that we use without realizing what we're gaining from them. But it's hard to tie, having clean water to one species. But I mean, something like the sturgeon can be a flagship for aquatic conservation across a drainage or watershed if we find it.
I ask this question as if I don't actually care. I do obviously care about all these animals, the laurel dace, I think every species is important. And I think for me at least, looking at it and why I think the search for lost species is so important and so interesting is that a lot of these species, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a shot in the dark that I think is probably going to land, a lot of them were disappeared because of us. Because of human activity to some degree. And I think in that sense, it is then beholden on us to determine what happened to them, whether that's to find out that they are in fact extinct or to, on the other golden hopeful side of it, to find a species that has been gone for as long as some of these species have been missing in action. I think it again, I think it just falls to us. It's our responsibility, since a lot of them are gone because of us, to determine whether or not what their ultimate fate was. That's what it means to me, at least. We have gone out now twice, and we're 0 for 2 in terms of finding Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon, except for the trench coat after the dinner party.
But we have learned a lot about other fishes within the system and the health of the ecosystem.
Okay, so you're preempting me because that's where that was going, was what is the benefit of these trips? What have we learned that makes it worth the investment of resources and your time, all three of you?
Well, remember, we could still get positive hits from our filters and the environmental DNA. And then we would want to go back to that section of river and upstream of there and do more intensive surveys with nets for the species and take additional environmental DNA samples.
Like focus your work where you think, based on eDNA results, you think they probably are.
Yes, we basically surveyed a river across the whole northern half of a country in 2 weeks. So there were a few gaps, but we actually, given the limited amount of time and some international borders that the river flows between and around and through, we covered the upper part of the Syr Darya Basin pretty well. But I think the most important thing is just getting eyes on the river itself from a scientific point of view, looking at the fish diversity, looking at the pollution. I was tagged as the person to take the diapers out of the net that got tangled in there. That was fun. One of them was full, and it kind of came apart.
Gross.
Yeah, well, it's just part of it.
Who said that science is clean?
Exactly. But it just gives scientists both local scientists in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent, the capital, and us, eyes on this aquatic ecosystem, which is really unique. There's many species found there and nowhere else in the world. On some of the smaller tributaries we went to, the larger tributaries, and the Syr Darya itself, and really get a snapshot in time of the health of the river. And compared to 2019, it looked like it was going downhill. Now, I would also like to go back to the area that we sampled in 2019, just above the reservoir in Kazakhstan, and see if we still get hundreds and maybe thousands of specimens of native fishes in our net like we did 6 years ago. Or was it a location thing, or is the health of the entire upper part of the river really going downhill?
So the trip then, the benefit isn't necessarily just limited to this one species that's the target of the work. It's getting a better eye on the entire ecology of the region.
Yes.
And there's a couple other red-listed species that occur in the reach that have been declining, and it would be nice to know what their population status and current status there is.
What are those species? Do you have any off the top of your head?
The white-eyed brim, another minnow, and luckily the environmental DNA lab in London, where our filters got sent to, they are going to be looking for other species that are imperiled and critically imperiled besides the Syr Darya Shovelnose Sturgeon. So that's the advantage of taking environmental DNA. You not only pick up the DNA from the species you're interested in, you get the DNA from rock scum and algae all the way up to the people in the river. It's all there on the filter. And so you can either do a big blast and see all the different species that might be on that filter, or you can target and look for specific species, or you can do both.
So when will we know the results of those eDNA tests?
4 to 6 weeks is the timeline I was given.
From today, from when we're recording, or from when you dropped them off?
From when they got the filters, we mailed them from Uzbekistan to the UK, and they arrived there about a week and a half ago.
Okay, so we're talking like end of May, beginning of June, maybe?
Yes.
Okay. What's your excitement level? You didn't see any firsthand, again, barring that preserved specimen. So are you still hopeful and excited about the potential for those eDNA results to return a positive hit?
I am, not only for the sturgeon, but also some of those imperiled minnows too. Yes.
Dave, are you feeling pretty anticipatory and hopeful?
Sure, for some of them. Seriously, it's a big river, and these are really tiny fish, and they're difficult to sample. So even if we had 100% detection probability, there's a lot of water that we didn't sample, that we just couldn't access. And if there weren't sturgeon or Turkestan barbel or other species, in the area where we were able to access the river to physically sample, we could have easily missed those.
Christian, are you looking forward to the results of those eDNA tests?
Absolutely. I am optimistic, and I think, like Dave said, in a way, it's finding a needle in a haystack, and there's a heck of a lot of hay. But we targeted the locations we did specifically because we thought that they were prime candidates for habitat for this fish. And so I think using that methodology, I'm feeling pretty hopeful that we may return something.
And just to give a sense of how this can turn out, there are 2 species of freshwater fishes right here in Tennessee and Virginia, the slender chub, which borders both states, and the Chucky mad tom, which is only in Tennessee. And recent eDNA studies have gotten positive hits on both of those species, even though one hasn't been seen for about 17 years and the slender chub hasn't been seen for about 20 years. And a team is actually going out next week to look for the Chucky mad tom.
Wow. I'm assuming that because of the nature of DNA, you can be fairly certain that if a positive return on a eDNA test appears, that eDNA doesn't last long in an environment, right? You can be fairly certain that it's a
We
recent.
didn't think that it lasted long, but there are people that are getting DNA out of lake bottom sediments that are 12, 15, 20,000 years old. So we don't know whether this is DNA from sediments that have been mobilized and carried up into the water column, or whether there's still fish out there that are actively producing these. There's no way to tell.
Okay, but still, it's more optimistic than being certain or thinking that they're gone for good.
Yes, and we did come across a gravel removal operation. We were going to sample DNA just upstream of this bridge, and we turned on this little road, and even though it hadn't rained the whole time we were there, the road was soaking wet. And we're like, what is going on? And then the first truck passed us, full of gravel from the Syr Darya, with all the water still leaking out of the back of the truck onto the road. And there were these two huge cranes just constantly grabbing up huge amounts of gravel and dumping them in these huge dump trucks and just taking them to wherever. And this was legal. The gravel mining operation, according to what Akbajan found out, was an auction for someone to win the rights to gravel mine there. But so you could be stirring up sediments that are hundreds of years old, and preserved environmental DNA could be getting up in the water column potentially.
Okay. Well, with that in mind, then you've made 2 attempts to find this animal. Is there a third round potentially in the works? I mean, would you go back? Is there enough reason to want to go back again?
If we get a positive hit on the eDNA, certainly. For the health of the river and trying to understand what we saw 6 years ago and what we saw in March of this year, I would like to go back to where we actually sampled in 2019 and see if the species list and the abundance of the individuals within a species is similar now than it was way back when, or are we going to get very few fishes that are all invasive like we got in the lower reaches of the Syr Darya in Uzbekistan? That really would give us a good window into the health of the ecosystem.
The lower portion of the river in Kazakhstan, below where the Aras River flows back into it, might be one of the last long enough stretches to really support larval drift that has maintained water flow for an extended period of time. That would be worth visiting as well.
So it sounds like you would be up for a third visit too then.
I'm always up for a field trip.
Christian, would you go back if you were still around and invited?
I would. I have a dissertation to finish, so I think chances are I'll be cheering on from the sidelines at home. But yeah, I mean, it truly was an incredible trip, and I would, if fate took me back there, I would happily say yes.
Awesome. All right, well, the search continues, I guess. And with that, I guess we can go ahead and end this episode of the podcast Aquatic. Thank you again to Dr. Bernie Kuhajda, to Christian, I just say your last name, I'm going to mess it up again.
Swartzbaugh.
There we go. And Dr. Dave Neely, our belated addition to the episode, but a welcome one nonetheless. Thank you, all of you, for taking the time to come and talk to us about this amazing adventure you went on and this little tiny sturgeon that we sure hope we find someday. If you have an idea for a future episode of the podcast Aquatic, send it to podcast@tnaqua.org. If you have a question for an expert like Dr. Bernie Kuhajda, Dr. Dave Neely, or Christian, send it to the same address, podcast@tnaqua.org. While you're online, leave us a review or a rating. Those are both free ways to support the show and are very much appreciated. And in the meantime, until next time, remember that every drop matters.